Hey, shalom, shalom, Israel. We're back with part 6 of counting to Shabuot. And today we are looking at verses 15 and 16 again of chapter 23 of Leviticus. These two verses are critical to being able to understand how to count the Omer correctly. And I'm going to go ahead and read it again from the scripture version. And from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, you shall count for yourselves 7 completed Sabbaths. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you count 50 days. Then you shall bring a new grain offering to Yahuwah. Now, yeah, this is really huge to be able to understand this verse. And last time we kind of mentioned that there are two major views on this. There's those who go with the Sabbath in verse 15, the first Sabbath mentioned, understanding it as the high Sabbath of the festival of unleavened bread, the 15th day of the first month. The morrow after would be fixed to the 16th day of the first month. Then there's another camp, which we talked about, the Sadducee method of counting the Omer, which they would link this Sabbath in question to the weekly Sabbath contained within the festival of unleavened bread. That would mean that their first day and their last day of their Omer count would actually land on the first day of the week. So what I've done is actually made a little chart to kind of better help see this. When we start talking about numbers, sometimes it's hard and you can get lost real easy. So sometimes pictures can definitely help. So here we have kind of a 1 through Shabbat. And the way again, the Sadducees reckon is day 1 of the Omer count would start on the first day of the week through Shabbat. And you can see they have 7 weeks, they have 7 Sabbaths, and they have actually 50 days. Now, in the last message, we talked a little bit about does Shabuot always land on the first day of the week? And we looked at Exodus chapter 19, where it mentions 4 times that Yah gave the Torah on the third day. And I highly recommend you check out the links that will be attached to these teachings, and there will be 2 great articles that will go in a lot more detail about how to count the Omer and everything like that, and also that third day mentioned in Exodus chapter 19. But today we're going to continue our look, and we're really trying to figure out, even though the Sadducee method has the 7 weeks, the 7 Sabbaths, 50 days, nevertheless, we need to ask some very serious questions. Are these the correct 50 days? And the answer is no. Are these the correct 7 weeks? And the answer is no. And are these the correct Sabbaths? And although they do have 7 weekly Sabbaths, which we are supposed to be counting, unfortunately, since they're starting from the wrong point, they are off. One, they have missed the first Sabbath. And that's what we want to look at today to help understand the context of verse 15 and 16. Because actually, interestingly, when you read this, a lot of people get really confused when you get to verse 16, where it says, the morrow after this 7th Sabbath, you shall count 50 days. Most people that have been taught the Sadducee method of counting, for them, they read that verse 16, the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, in their mind, 7 plus 7, and then the morrow after, that's 50. That would mean the morrow after, that'd be the first day of the week. So that means the wave offering would have to be on the first day of the week, and that'd be end of the discussion. And I can understand the frustration a lot of people would have when they read that verse. It seems pretty straightforward, but when you actually look a little bit deeper, which we're going to be looking at that specific, the morrow after the 7th Sabbath next time, this will definitely help. If that's you, then this series is made specifically for those who maybe haven't actually studied this out fully, maybe just read it in one version, one verse, and they've adopted this Sadducee method of counting the Omer, and we need to look a little deeper. That's what this is all about. So let's look. All right, today we're going to be looking at perfect weeks versus common weeks. And this concept is very important to understand if we're going to get how to count the Omer correctly. And I want to give some background a little bit. We've already covered how in Leviticus 23, there are different classes of Sabbaths. There are the weekly Sabbaths that happen every seventh day, and then we have the high annual Sabbaths that are tied into Yah's appointed times throughout the year. For example, the first day of unleavened bread is a high Sabbath, and we've kind of covered this already. But the important point is there is a distinction between the weekly Sabbaths and the high Sabbath. Now, that same concept, we can see this in the scripture as we study it out with weeks. We see in Genesis 1 and 2 that from creation, Yah made the heavens and earth in 6 days and rested on the Sabbath, that seventh day. And we see this repeated in Exodus 20 when he's giving the Torah. He says, Zakar, to remember the Sabbath day, to set it apart, and gives that example that points back to the Creator and creation, that we should follow in that pattern. Now, that is just 1 through 7, with the 7 being Shabbat, and that cycle's been going on since Genesis 1 and 2. But there's something else that's the scripture makes reference to, and it is just a Shabuot, just a plain 7-day period. And this is really important when we're talking about the festival of weeks, or Shabuot, to understand that in the scripture there are just 7-day periods. For example, the festival of unleavened bread and the festival of tabernacles in most years are just 7 days, not necessarily lining up with the perfect week, with the first day of either one lining up. It could line up on a perfect week if the first day of unleavened bread was on the first day of the week. Same thing with Sukkot, but in many years it's not the case. There are many other laws and instructions. For example, if a woman is menstruating, starts bleeding, she is 7 days set apart. And if someone would touch a dead body, again, 7 days. You're going to see the 7 days throughout the scripture. I highly recommend you studying this out because it's really fascinating, all the different things that require 7 days. For the animals that were offered up to Yahuwah for 7 days, you weren't supposed to offer anything up. The 8th day, the priest actually could then offer it up to Yahuwah. So these cycles of 7 are very fascinating throughout the scripture. Especially laws with purity and with mothers that give birth, all sorts of different things. They're just periods of 7 days. And regardless of when they land, they're just 7 days. Kind of like in our language when we say, hey, I'll see you next week, it doesn't necessarily have to tie into the perfect week. And the reason why this is important, when we get to Deuteronomy 16:9, where it says, count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count 7 weeks from the time you put the sickle to the grain. The question we have to ask is, are these 7 weeks that start our count really to Shavuot, are they perfect weeks, or are they kind of the common weeks? Are they just a Shabuah? And really, when we study this out, as we've been kind of going through, and as we continue, it's very, very clear that these are common weeks. They're 7 sevens, literally 7 sevens. And we'll look at this a little bit more here soon. Here is the Omer chart for 2020, and I wanted to just kind of highlight some things that incorporating this the 7 Sabbaths and the 7 weeks that we're supposed to be counting. We'll cover this 50 days next time, but this will be easier to see this way. But again, from Leviticus 23:15, where it says, "You shall count until you from the morrow after the Sabbath," that's the morrow after the 15th day, the 16th day, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. So I've circled the 7 Sabbaths. These 7 Sabbaths that shall be complete are perfect ones. They're tying into creation, that 7th-day Sabbath. And you can see the 7 that are listed. Now, the reason why I want to bring this up is because people that go with the Sadducee reckoning of counting the Omer, they are really thrown off that you're on day 2 and you've counted 1 Sabbath. In their mind, it's impossible, because if they're counting perfect weeks, the Sabbath is on the 7th day for them. So how could you have a Sabbath before you have the 7 days on day 2 of an Omer count? Is because of the starting point. The 7 weeks are common weeks. Starting from the 16th, you're just counting 7 days out. as I've circled here with the kind of a yellow highlight, 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, and 49, just counting by sevens, 7 sevens. But also you have 7 Shabbats, weekly Shabbats. And for a lot of people, this is really confusing. For example, today we're entering into the 37th day of the Omer count, and this is actually the 6th Sabbath, but we haven't had 6 weeks yet. That will happen on day 42, the Omer count, next 5th day of the week. But just wanted to show you that this, it's a little bit more helpful to understand. It's also, you can see that when it tells us the Messiah rose on Mia Sabbaton, or the first of the Sabbaths, that if you use the Sadducee reckoning of time, that'd be a full week later. He'd been still in the grave for a full week before it would have been the first Sabbath, according to their reckoning of time. And that's just not what happened. So, and able to be able to count the 3 days, 3 nights, the third day, the Mia Sabbaton resurrection, you got to understand when to count the Omer. That's why so many people have been confused by this, because they cannot rightly divide which Sabbaths, rightly divide which weeks, and therefore have been not being able to calculate even the 50 days properly. So count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count 7 weeks from the time you put the sickle to the grain, and that is on day 16 of month 1. When we come back, we're going to be looking at that morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you shall count 50 days, and we're going to look at it a little bit closer. And this is nothing new. This has been going on for a very long time, this debate, but by maybe looking at that and gaining some understanding, we can have all the pieces, not just the 7 Sabbaths, not the 7 weeks, but the 50 days, all congruent and working together. And that's what we're going to look at next time when we come back. Shalom.